The last 3 months of 2015 are going to be some of the busiest and best in MMA. The UFC has 11 events planned over a period of 13 weeks. Now that can be a lot for the average fan to digest. That's why we're here to break it down for you. On September 27th, the UFC heads to Japan for UFC Fight Night. Notable fights on the card include the headliner of Josh Barnett against Roy Nelson and a middleweight bout between Gegard Mousasi and Uriah Hall. A week later, on October 3rd, the UFC travels to Houston, Texas for UFC 192. Light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier takes on Alexander Gustafsson. Then there's Johnny Hendricks vs. Tyron Woodley, Ryan Bader vs. Rashad Evans, Jessica Eye vs. Juliana Pena, and Joseph Benavidez vs. Ali Bagautinov. The UFC goes on holidays for 2 weeks before heading off to Dublin, Ireland for UFC Fight Night. Dustin Poirier takes on Ireland's own Joseph Duffy in the main event, while Stipe Miocic fights Ben Rothwell in the co-main event. A week of no action is quickly followed by 4 straight weekends with UFC events. The first takes place in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and features a rematch between Vitor Belfort and Dan Henderson. Glover Teixeira takes on surging light heavyweight Pat Cummins in the co-main event. A week later, the UFC travels to Australia for UFC 193. Champions Ronda Rousey and Joanna Jędrzejczyk take on heavy underdogs Holly Holm and Valerie Letourneau. Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva will attempt to recreate the magic of their first fight, while Michael Bisping takes on Australia's own Robert Whittaker. 6 days later, the UFC heads back to the Western Hemisphere for the Tough Latin America 2 finale. The card is headlined by Matt Brown and Kelvin Gastelum. Other notable fights on the card include Ricardo Lamas vs. Diego Sanchez and Jusio Formiga vs. Henry Cejudo. To finish up November, the UFC will be heading back to the Eastern Hemisphere for UFC Fight Night Henderson Alves. The card is currently headlined by Benson Henderson and Thiago Alves, with Mirko Cro Cop, Dong Hyun Kim, and Yoshihiro Akiyama all scheduled to fight. The UFC then takes a much-needed break before heading into one of the busiest weekends in UFC history. The UFC has scheduled 3 cards to happen within 3 days. On Thursday, the UFC will hold UFC Fight Night 80. The card doesn't have a main event as of now. Hi, Future Michael here. Since the video was made, the UFC has announced Paige VanZant vs. Joanne Calderwood as the main event, as well as Jim Miller and Michael Chiesa fighting on the card. Now back to you, past Michael. But currently features Thiago Santos vs. Elia Teodoro. The Tough 22 finale takes place on the Friday, with Frankie Edgar and Chad Mendes main eventing. Khabib Nurmagomedov is also scheduled to fight on the card against Tony Ferguson. Then on Saturday, it's the event that everyone's been waiting for and everybody hopes stays intact. UFC 194 features 2 title fights and a whole bunch of key divisional matchups. Jose Aldo and Conor McGregor will fight in the main event to unify the UFC Featherweight Championship. Middleweight champion Chris Weidman will face one of his toughest tasks to date in Luke Rockhold. Jacare Souza takes on Yoel Romero, and Miesha Tate vs. Amanda Nunes has been rumored for the card. Other notable fights that could find their way onto the main card are Max Holloway vs. Jeremy Stephens, Tisha Torres vs. Michelle Waterson, and Damian Maia vs. Gunnar Nelson. To end off the calendar year, the UFC heads to Orlando, Florida for UFC on Fox Dos Anjos vs. Cerrone. The card's headlined by the lightweight title fight between Rafael Dos Anjos and Donald Cerrone, with Junior Dos Santos and Alistair Overeem as the co-main event. Michael Johnson will take on Nate Diaz, who hasn't fought since December of last year. So that's what's in store for the next 3 months in the UFC. Just to give you a little recap of the biggest fights of those 3 months, here we go. Gegard Mousasi vs. Uriah Hall, Josh Barnett vs. Roy Nelson, Rashad Evans vs. Ryan Bader, Johnny Hendricks vs. Tyron Woodley, Daniel Cormier vs. Alexander Gustafsson, Dustin Poirier vs. Joe Duffy, Vitor Belfort vs. Dan Henderson, Mark Hunt vs. Bigfoot Silva 2, Joanna Jędrzejczyk vs. Valerie Letourneau, Ronda Rousey vs. Holly Holm, Matt Brown vs. Kelvin Gastelum, Benson Henderson vs. Thiago Alves, Khabib Nurmagomedov vs. Tony Ferguson, Frankie Edgar vs. Chad Mendes, Max Holloway vs. Jeremy Stephens, Gunnar Nelson vs. Damian Maia, Miesha Tate vs. Amanda Nunes, Jacare Souza against Yoel Romero, Chris Weidman against Luke Rockhold, Conor McGregor against Jose Aldo, Michael Johnson vs. Nate Diaz, Junior Dos Santos vs. Alistair Overeem, and Rafael Dos Anjos vs. Donald Cerrone. That is going to be a hell of a 3 months, and I can't wait.